Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, Popular Sovereignty, the U.S. U.K. Special Relationship in the Age of Trump, Farage and Brexit. Please welcome Andrew Hale, Senior Policy Analyst in Trade Policy in the Heritage Foundation's Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to our program today. As the announcer just said, Popular Sovereignty, the U.S. U.K. Special Relationship in the Age of Trump, Farage and Brexit. The UK Conservative Party was swept from power this month with its worst election defeat ever. The so-called Conservatives went from an historic win in 2018 with the slogan, "Get Brexit Done," where they won 365 seats in Parliament. This month, they lost 251 seats and were reduced to a devastating 121 seats. Some have suggested that they may never recover, and they are witnessing a paradigm shift in British politics. Professional pollster and GB News broadcaster Matthew Goodwin joins Heritage Day to explain these unprecedented election results. How will the new Labour government approach the US-UK special relationship? Will Labour seek closer ties with the US or closer realignment with the European Union? Why did the Conservative government fail to secure UK borders from unprecedented illegal migration? Why did the so-called Conservatives raise taxes to their highest levels since Clement Attlee's Labour government in the 1940s? Is this because the Conservative Party campaigned as Conservatives but governed as woke Social Democrats? Professor Goodwin has called this election the punishment election. What led to over 4 million people voting for Nigel Farage's Reform Party? Professor Goodwin, who was responsible for the election analysis for GB News, can answer these questions and more. Matthew Goodwin is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent. He is also a senior fellow at the Legatum Institute and was an associate fellow at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Recently, he established the UK's second most successful Substack with over 40,000 subscribers. Indeed, I'm a subscriber, and I recommend that you all subscribe as well for the latest analysis of UK and US politics. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm Heritage Foundation welcome to Professor Goodwin.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for the warm welcome. Thank you to the Heritage Foundation. I'm fortunate to give talks in many places. I can honestly say that the welcome I've received over the last 24 hours has been one of the warmest that I've encountered. So thank you to Andrew and the team for making it so enjoyable. I've been given 10 minutes to make some opening remarks. So what I'm going to do in the 10 minutes is explain to you why I think the British Conservative Party just suffered their heaviest defeat in history. And then we're going to get into the detail as to what is really happening with the Labour government and, of course, our special relationship. The short answer to the question of why the Conservatives collapsed was actually hinted at in Andrew's remarks, which is that the Conservative Party was severely punished by an electorate that largely agrees with many Conservative policies, but came to the conclusion that after 14 years in government, the Conservative Party was no longer what its name implied. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that the election of the largest Labour majority since Tony Blair's majority of 1997 indicates some kind of mass public enthusiasm for social democratic politics, because that is misleading. Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have just come into office with the lowest share of the vote for any incoming majority government since the 1880s. The level of turnout fell to one of the lowest levels that we've had on record. The combined share of the vote for the two established parties, Labour and the Conservatives, has fallen to the lowest share since the emergence of our two-party system. So the real story at this election really was about disillusionment and disengagement. It was about an electorate that is frustrated and fed up with the policy choices that were made by a Conservative Party, which, as Andrew said, was given a unique 80-seat majority in 2019 under Boris Johnson, was given a unique political realignment that was similar to your own realignment in 2016, but which subsequently squandered all of that goodwill that was given to it by the electorate. And if you look at what happened at the 2024 general election, essentially the Conservative Party was hit on three flanks at the same time. To some extent, it was hit by voters defecting from the Conservatives to the Labour Party. About 10% of Conservative voters moved from right to left. But 25% of Conservative voters moved from the right to Nigel Farage and the Reform Party on the right-wing flank of the Conservative Party. An even larger number of voters, however, about 2.6 million voters, didn't vote at all. 2.6 million voters who voted for the Conservatives in 2019 and who then took one look at Rishi Sunak and the party 2 weeks ago and said, I don't think I really want to endorse this anymore. Which raises the obvious question as to why. Well, if you look at the 4 million voters, as I've done, who defected to Nigel Farage and Reform, as you know, Nigel Farage is friends with your former president, and I suspect soon to be your next president. The number one reason for defecting was that they wanted to stop illegal migration into Britain. Since 2018, we've had more than 120,000 illegal migrants enter Britain on the small boats in the Channel, which has made a mockery of our country's claim after the vote for Brexit to be a self-governing, independent, sovereign nation. The Conservative Party consistently refused to leave international and European courts, such as the European Convention on Human Rights, that would have allowed our country to reclaim full control over its own national borders. The second reason why voters defected to Nigel Farage and Reform was because they wanted to lower the overall level of legal, not illegal, but legal migration, which under the Conservative Party has spiraled from 300,000 net migration in 2010 when the Conservatives came to power to nearly 700,000 in 2024. In other words, the Conservative Party had presided over the biggest population explosion that we've seen since the late 1940s when troops were coming back from World War II, and we had a baby boom among British families in the aftermath of the Second World War. The difference is our population explosion today is primarily due to mass legal immigration. And the Conservatives promised us in 2017 and 2019 that immigration, that mass immigration, would be high skill, high wage, highly selective, and would be a net fiscal benefit to the economy. What we now know is that form of migration that the Conservatives presided over, chiefly Boris Johnson, was low wage, low skill, non-selective migration that has taken more out of the national economy than it's put in. So what we are living through is a policy of managed decline. We're not living through a policy that is actively expanding and growing our economy. Furthermore, over the last 14 years, rather than pushing back against the creeping advance of radical progressive policies or woke ideology in schools, universities, and the public institutions, the Conservative Party has mainstreamed many of those policies that the Labour government initially introduced in the 2000s under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Critical race theory, gender ideology, all of those ideas that you're very familiar with in the US are now becoming embedded within many of our institutions in the UK. And the Conservatives put up almost no serious opposition to that. And in terms of the economy, a fiscally conservative party which talks a lot about tax cuts, as Andrew said in his opening remarks, gave us the highest tax burden since the 1950s. Raised corporation tax on businesses after the vote for Brexit at exactly the time that we should be encouraging inward investment into the UK economy. And while they promised to level up areas of the country that had been historically left behind by a London-centric economy built on financial services, they never really delivered on that policy. They never really delivered leveling up in a serious, sustained way. So on pretty much every dimension of Conservative policy, the British Tories fundamentally failed to do what they promised voters they would do, which is why I call it the punishment election. Ask yourself a simple question. Why is it that the Republicans under Donald Trump have stayed so much closer and more aligned with the post-2016 realignment? Why have they continued to maintain support among the working class, among voters without college degrees, while expanding that coalition among Hispanic, Latino, and African American voters, while the British Conservatives completely lost touch with that post-Brexit realignment, hemorrhaging support among the working class, hemorrhaging support among non-graduates? The biggest losses for the Conservative Party 2 weeks ago were among the middle-aged, among Zoomers, Millennials, and Gen Xers. And so the average age at which somebody now is likely to become a Conservative voter has been pushed back from 42 at the last election to 64 today. So the Conservative electorate has become even older than it was during the previous 14 years. So I would put it to you that what we are witnessing now in British politics is a Conservative Party that is philosophically, ideologically, and electorally lost. The Conservative Party no longer really knows what it is. It no longer knows who's voting for it. And it no longer really knows why those people are voting for it. It's suffering a prolonged identity crisis. Nigel Farage and the Reform Party are directly benefiting from that by actively offering what I would consider to be a conservative platform. Complete opposition to woke ideology in schools and universities, calls for tax cuts, the removal of regulation for small businesses, greater divergence, not convergence, with the European Union, a closer relationship with the United States that should be prioritized over our relationship with a failing and declining European Union, an immediate freeze on all non-essential, non-high-skill immigration, our exit from the European Convention on Human Rights so we can fully control who comes in and who goes out of our own country, and the complete reform of public sector institutions so that they are what they're supposed to be, which is politically neutral and objective, not highly politicized institutions that are there to indirectly support the Labour Party. So what Nigel Farage has done is throwing down a gauntlet to the British Conservative Party. And the only thing the Conservative Party has ever understood is pressure from outside. That's the story of the last 15 years in British politics. That was what the vote for Brexit was all about. That's what the rise of earlier parties on the right of the Conservatives was all about. The UK Independence Party, the Brexit Party. The key question is whether the British Conservative Party is now going to listen to that message. And over the next 3 months, you're going to see the election of a new Conservative leader who has a choice. They can either continue to turn the Conservative Party into a lighter version of the Labour Party. They can commit to the new post-Brexit consensus of big state, big debt, big tax, big immigration, big on woke politics. Or they can listen to the message that the voters are sending them, which is that they would like to see a Conservative Party that is everything that its name implies. And with that, Andrew, I think we'll go into some discussion and questions, but thank you for listening to my opening remarks.
Professor Goodwin, what can we expect from the Labour Party after being out of power for 14 years?
Well, the first thing to say about the Labour government that we now have is it's got an enormous mandate, even if it doesn't have mass public enthusiasm. So you have an enormous, the biggest majority since 1997. So what the Labour Party is going to do is use that majority to do what Tony Blair did, which is bring about sweeping economic, political, and cultural change. We're going to see tax increases, inevitably, because our public finances are already so stretched. We're going to see a big investment in net zero, green politics and accompanying tax rises and levies. We're going to see the introduction of votes for 16-year-olds, sweeping constitutional changes, including the reform of the House of Lords and further devolution to Scotland Wales and Northern Ireland. We're going to see a growing push to realign our country with the European Union, which I would argue is failing, declining, is stagnating, is not where we should be investing in terms of our future prosperity. You're going to see an increase in both legal and illegal migration. Indeed, Labour have already said they're essentially going to give an amnesty to the 100,000 people who have entered the country illegally over the last 4 years, which inevitably will incentivise more people to come to the UK from outside of Europe, mainly from countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, parts of Asia, Central Asia especially. And so you're going to see, I think, the continuation of the New Labour revolution between 1997 and 2010. But it's going to be very radical, and it's going to involve, I think, especially an expansion of the state. Labour have already made it clear that they're going to further empower unelected, unaccountable organisations like the Office for Budget Responsibility in order to curtail any political experiments, any policies that fall outside of what we might call the new elite consensus in British politics. So the Quangos, the quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisations, let's say the blob, the deep state, whatever our preferred phrase, those are going to expand enormously over the next 5 years. So it's going to be a radical, far-reaching political experiment, and one with this big majority backing it up. So there will be no checks on this Labour government, essentially, because the Conservatives are now so weak.
Looking at the Conservative Party, they have to do some soul searching. Are they going to double down on what led them to defeat, or will they change course? I mean, we've had some unfortunate messaging from George Osborne, who says they should stick to, going towards the left and not to the right. So where do you think they'll go?
Well, the Conservative Party is currently on life support. The question is whether the leader that is incoming will get them off life support and into recovery, or will push them into a death spiral. I mean, it really is that serious for the Conservatives. The old joke among pollsters was that the Conservative vote would never fall below 30%, because that's when you get to pensioners in care homes and they're all pro-Conservative and they don't really know what's going on out there in the world, and they'll always reliably vote Conservative. Well, the Conservative vote just fell to 23% of the national vote. This is a party in serious, prolonged crisis. There is no guarantee that political parties must survive and last forever. Look at Canada in 1993. We're in a similar situation. And because of this pressure from Nigel Farage and Reform, if the Conservatives now make the wrong calculation, if they choose a leader such as Tom Tugendhat, a sort of liberal, one-nation Conservative who says, you know what, I'm comfortable with migration. I don't think we should have a deterrent for illegal migration. I'm pretty comfortable with the taxation consensus. I'm pretty comfortable with a big state. That's not a big problem. If they do that, Nigel Farage will never have had as much space as he would have over the next 5 years. And the Conservatives, instead of losing 25% of their vote to this revolt on their right, could easily lose 50, 60, 70% of their vote. So this really is a critical position for the party to be. Now, my instinct, having briefed, a lot of Conservative MPs over the last few years, including 2 of our last 3 prime ministers, is the Conservative Parliamentary Party, which is left in the House of Commons, 121 MPs, as Andrew said. This is a mainly southern, Oxbridge-educated, socially liberal cohort of Conservative MPs who, how can I put this diplomatically, don't spend much time outside of London. I suspect they will push the party left. And if they do that, potentially this really will be lights out for the Conservatives. Because, as I say, Reform and Farage will have enormous opportunity to realign the right, okay? Just one statistic. For every voter that the Conservative Party just lost to the Labour Party, they lost nearly 3 to Nigel Farage and Reform. So if Conservative elites are going to convince themselves the answer is becoming a social democratic party, then I'm afraid they have no idea what's coming.
You were very critical in your presentation just now about Boris Johnson. Now, he has a lot of friends in this room, and even in Washington, he comes on Fox News, he does the rounds in Washington. But you made a rather harsh headline a few days ago, and you said, blame Boris Johnson for the insane immigration hell. And I think to an American audience, they might find that somewhat disconcerting because he's been labeled in the American press, and certainly in the mainstream media, as the British Trump. So clearly you don't think that Boris Johnson is the British Trump.
I think that says more about our media class and the reality of British politics. Look, I briefed Boris just shortly after he came into number 10, and I talked him through who had voted for him, and Boris is a very charismatic, interesting politician, but Boris Johnson is not a conservative. Boris Johnson is a bohemian liberal. He's not a conservative. Here are a few things Boris did. He completely liberalized the immigration system, not around high-skill migration, which is what he promised, but around masses of low-skill, low-wage, non-selective migration that, as I've said, the research shows clearly is a net fiscal drain, not benefit on the economy. Here's another thing Boris Johnson did. He removed the requirement of British companies to advertise jobs in Britain before they advertise them overseas. That's not a conservative. That's not somebody who's putting the national community first. I personally also struggled with the character and integrity, or the lack of character and integrity, that Johnson showed during his time in public office, and that, as we know from the research, was a significant reason why the Conservatives lost a lot of swing voters. So whatever your personal views about Boris, I understand why people like him. He's a charismatic, funny guy. But if you want to understand why the Conservative Party lost touch with their realignment, with that post-Brexit shift in politics, that story, in many respects, begins with Boris Johnson. Voters were promised the opposite of what he delivered. Go back and look at the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. We will lower the overall numbers. We will take back control. We will reclaim ownership of Britain's borders. They then did the very opposite of all of those things. So if you treat your voters with contempt, what happens is your voters will punish you, which is what we saw at this election. So the Boris Johnson's coalition completely imploded. To give you one example, one statistic, in 2019, what Johnson did was remarkable. He won 76% of all voters who went for Brexit. 76%. He completely reshaped the Conservative Party around that Brexit electorate. And that made a lot of sense because it's geographically very efficient. Under a first-past-the-post system, all of those voters were scattered across small towns, medium towns, coastal communities, which left the left dependent upon big cities and university towns. That's why Johnson smashed the Labour Party in 2019. But by the time the Conservatives got to the election 2 weeks ago, that 76% had fallen to 36%. Okay, so the Brexit voters fled the Conservative Party because they were given the very opposite of what they were promised. This is not a difficult problem to solve. So as I say, the Conservatives now have an option. They can either learn the lessons from what happened under Boris Johnson and change and renew, which is what the Conservative Party has always done. That's why it's so successful through history, from Disraeli to Winston Churchill to Margaret Thatcher. Or they can continue on this path and enter oblivion, which is currently where they're heading.
Now, you've been very critical of Boris Johnson, but what about, we had David Cameron elected in 2010, then we had Theresa May, then we had, of course, we mentioned Boris Johnson, we had the 49-day car crash of Liz Truss, and then, of course, we've had just Rishi Sunak. In the last 3 years, the United Kingdom's taken in, 4 million people? What did the other prime ministers in that period of the last 14 minutes? Why did they do something about this? Is it the same problem, or?
I think it's been very difficult for many voters to watch Conservative Party elites try and navigate the issue of immigration. Because Conservative Party elites find the issue of immigration difficult to talk about. They ultimately view it as a low-status issue. They view it as an issue they'd rather not have to talk about. They view it as something that's damaging to their social status. They don't like to get involved.
What do you mean their social status?
Well, there's a stigma in the British class system when it comes to talking about issues like immigration, which is why so many conservatives in Britain adopt the language of the left when they refer to things like culture wars. Now, my argument would be defending the sex-based rights of women, defending the rights of our children not to be indoctrinated in schools, defending our national community, upholding the borders of that community are not culture wars. They are the foundations of our civilization, and they are the things that ultimately, wanting to defend those things is what makes us conservative, I would argue. But the British conservative elite, from David Cameron through to Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, have held back consistently from engaging with those issues. And if anything, they've mainstreamed a lot of those issues, helping the Labour Party to essentially implement its policies even while we've had conservative governments. And so what I think we're seeing is what you saw in the United States between 2015 and 2018, which is the emergence now of a new generation of conservatives, some of whom are not in the Conservative Party, who are saying, actually, we're not going to go along with this anymore. We want to change the nature of conservatism in our country so that it better reflects the values and the voice of millions of ordinary people. So the ideological battle is very much underway.
Turning to Rishi Sunak, he fought so hard, not through the democratic process, but to knife Boris Johnson in the back to become Prime Minister. He was his Chancellor of the Exchequer, his Treasury Minister. What was the point of him? What did he achieve? He said he was going to control immigration. He said he was going to do all these things, revive the economy. What did he actually achieve?
Well, just to begin with Boris Johnson briefly, the joke about Boris Johnson is he was the third Prime Minister to be brought down by Boris Johnson, in the sense that Boris Johnson had successfully dispatched Theresa May, and then he firstly had helped bring down David Cameron, his old nemesis, through the Brexit vote. He then had brought down Theresa May through her soft Brexit compromise, let's call it. And then he brought himself down through his general conduct in office and failing to represent Conservative voters. Rishi Sunak was an interesting follow-on from Boris Johnson because Rishi Sunak didn't have any mandate at all. I mean, he was elected by his local constituents, but he was never elected as a Conservative leader. He was appointed by other Conservative elites. So the moment Rishi Sunak took over, he was already in a weak and vulnerable place. But the most remarkable and peculiar thing about Rishi Sunak is that he then helped to bring down Boris Johnson when he was in office. He then helped to bring down Liz Truss when she was in office. And then he eventually got to the top of the greasy pole. And it quickly became apparent that he didn't really have any idea as to what he wanted to do with that power. So if you think about Rishi Sunak like this, what was it all for? What was the project? What was the vision? How did you want to change the country? Because what he ushered in was a ban on smoking. And what he ushered in was stopping a high-speed rail line.
And of course, maths in school. He wanted more maths in school.
He wanted some more maths teaching in schools. But you sort of looked at Rishi Sunak and thought, well, what was it all for, this big struggle, this chaos and carnage within the Conservative Party? And I say that because I think, in a way, Sunak reflects the broader problem with our political class. He was a technocrat. He was a manager. He'd come out of financial services straight into politics, had been parachuted to the top. And then somebody pulled back the curtain and it became apparent that there was no project. There was no renewal of Conservative ideology. There was no marked departure from what had gone on before. It was basically tinkering around the edges. And so what I'm suggesting to you is the only way that the Conservative Party can get out of this identity crisis, which is now what it's in, is by doing a full-blown, top-to-bottom, ideological rebirth. It has to really go back to basics. It really has to use this leadership contest to figure out what it believes and to figure out what kind of party it wants to be. Because there are a lot of Conservative parties in Europe doing very well right now. Europe just moved sharply to the right at the European Parliament elections, and I suspect America, let's see, but my instinct is America will probably follow suit in November. And that will leave the British Conservatives in an awkward position, asking themselves, well, why are all these Conservative parties seemingly doing so well or holding on to a large amount of support while we're failing. And I think they really need to rediscover what their unifying principles are and ultimately who they want to vote for them. Because, just lastly, Andrew, let me just say this. If Labour have re-emerged as a dominant party in Scotland, which they have, if Labour are even stronger in Wales, which they are, if Labour are now completely dominant in the big cities and the university towns, which they are, the only territory left for the Conservative Party is non-London England, are the small towns, the medium towns, the coastal communities, what you might call the flyover country, the working class districts, the heartlands, the north, the red wall. Now, you're not going to win those areas with liberal conservatism. That's not going to work. You're only going to win those areas if you actually deliver a series of conservative policies that work for an alliance of working class voters, some older voters, some professional voters, cut taxes, cut regulation, push back the state, but also protect the borders, lower migration, and deliver on all of those policies. That ultimately is what the Conservative Party need to think about doing.
How will a new Labour government approach the U.S.-U.K. special relationship? In particular, will Labour seek closer trade ties with the United States or closer realignment with the European Union? For example, Sir Keir Starmer, of course, was very opposed to Brexit. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. So the thing you have to remember about the current Labour government and much of the front bench is that they were only 5 years ago wholly united in trying to reverse the vote for Brexit and trying to bring about a second referendum on the Brexit question so that we could essentially stay in, if not rejoin, the European Union. So while Labour officially are saying that they have no serious interest in overturning Brexit, the underlying logic and instinct of the party is to prioritise a closer alignment and relationship with the European Union over other relationships elsewhere. And I personally think that is a problem for several reasons. One is the European Union is a declining share of the global economy. It is divided between East and West, mainly over cultural issues, over the advance of socially liberal values, which Eastern European countries are not supportive of. But they're also divided between North and South over economic policy, taxation, and debt. I think my personal view is the European Union is an insufficiently democratic organization and at times is an openly corrupt organization. There's no meaningful competition for executive office in the European Union. And if you look at what just happened at elections across the continent, the European Union is clearly heading into protracted political turmoil, with a lot of anti-establishment parties now being elected, enjoying record levels of support. My personal view is that is not a bloc that the UK should be closely aligned with, never mind rejoining anytime soon. The promise of Brexit was to deliver, as our special relationship unit at the Legatum Institute is working on under Lady Elliott and Sarah Elliott, the UK needs to forge a much closer relationship with the United States, a much closer trading relationship with the United States. We need to capitalize on the opportunities that we have in terms of joining free trade agreements elsewhere in the world. We need to be much more flexible, nimble, and reactive to what's going on outside of Europe. And in terms of defense and security, we also, to be frank, need to be aligned much more closely with the United States, given the many tensions that exist between Berlin, Paris, and Rome, not just on defense and Ukraine, but also on things like energy. So I'm hopeful that that's the longer-term direction of the UK, but the current Labour government certainly does not share that thinking. No matter what David Lammy, our new Foreign Secretary, says, they are also, by the way, incredibly hostile to Donald Trump. And on Substack, I've written extensively about the various things Labour ministers have said about potentially your next president. And I do think that will be a factor in undermining that relationship after November. which I would be very sad to see.
Well, just on a positive note, the Heritage Foundation has been working very closely with the Legatum Institute and Lady Sarah Elliott. Indeed, we worked together to bring some Labour members of Parliament here a week before I think it was about a week before the general election. And indeed, the shadow export minister, they were very, very optimistic. They actually were a bit over-optimistic. They said they wanted to have a U.K.-U.S. free trade agreement within 100 days of a Labour government. And of course, that's just simply not possible because of the bureaucracy involved and the fact that when President Trump left office, there were 12 free trade negotiations taking place with 12 different countries. And of course, they were very close to inking one with Kenya. And of course, the UK-US free trade negotiations were actively in process. And of course, all that ended when Trump left office and Biden took over because he does not want a free trade agreement with any country, anywhere. He doesn't even want to have market access talks with any country, anywhere. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, I don't think they were just being diplomatic. We've had some very good messaging, and the talks have been quite constructive. But moving on, you briefly mentioned woke. And I think it's of the establishment parties in the last election, they didn't mention woke. And I think the Reform Party's manifesto was the only one that mentioned woke. And I want to talk about this because I returned to the United Kingdom. I'm a dual national, both the United States and the United Kingdom. And I returned to the United Kingdom in 2017. And during my first week on the job, I had the opportunity to speak to our Permanent Secretary, the most senior civil servant in the department. And I asked her, I said, Permanent Secretary, what's the ultimate goal you have this year for the Department for International Trade? What do you want to have achieved this time next year? And she said, Andrew, that's a great question. I want to make sure that this time next year, I get the highest ranking from Stonewall as the most inclusive employer for transgendered and non-binary people. Now, I'd like to make a disclaimer. I'm actually inclusive, nurturing, and affirming of all people in keeping with civil service values. My favorite economist is Deirdre McCloskey, who, of course, transitioned in the 1990s. A brilliant economist who was actually presented here at the Heritage Foundation several years ago. So I'm inclusive, but I would have thought that the most senior civil servant, Antonio Romeo, would have actually, who's tipped to become the next cabinet secretary and the head of the entire civil service, I would have thought she would have said something like, well, my goal next year, I want to have achieved X export wins, or X free trade agreements, or market access discussions, or memorandums with individual US states on increased market access. None of that, she didn't mention any of that. Mm-hmm. And I was quite surprised. And there seems to be, in every aspect of the British state, a really worrying race to the bottom to see, an intersectional race to the bottom to see who is more disadvantaged and persecuted. And it's everywhere. I mean, I went for an Army Reserve training day, and I was subjected to 5 hours of DEI and ESG lectures. It was bizarre. I got up and walked out. I said, where's the warfare tactics? Where's the security policy? How did this happen? Where did this come from? This has been going unabated under 14 years of a so-called conservative government. But where on earth did this come from? And why did it's permeated everything. It's like the new religion.
Well, it is a new religion, and I think in a way the UK is importing many ideas, ideologies, frameworks that have, until recently, become embedded here in the United States. One of my colleagues in Westminster wrote a book recently called This Is Not America, pointing out that Britain has sort of somehow convinced itself that we should be applying the same school of thought that's infected many of your institutions. Our civil service, I would argue, has become openly politicized. Our National Health Service is filled with liberal progressive insignia. I work in the universities. I can tell you a lot of those have become openly politically activist. I've been in the universities for more than 20 years. The last 10 years especially, you've seen a doubling down by the university class on many ideas that are untested. And if you're interested, one of the reports, the seminal watershed reports that we had recently in the UK, was the Cass review of what was happening in our National Health Service by Dr. Hilary Cass. And she concluded that essentially we had been pushing many children down medical pathways without there being anywhere near the sufficient amount of evidence that would be required. I mean, the evidence wasn't there to justify those kinds of interventions. But even despite that, these ideas have continued to circulate in many of our institutions. And as my opening remarks, I spoke very directly and candidly, but I think you can sense where my frustration lies. Is the Conservatives really did nothing about this. The Conservative Party could have really removed the foundations of radical progressivism by repealing the Equalities Act, which was brought in by New Labour, by forcibly reminding public sector institutions that they have a duty to remain politically impartial and neutral, by undertaking a comprehensive curriculum review of what we're teaching kids in the schools, among other things. Made these arguments to the Conservative Party. The only thing we were able to pass, which now has left me as something of a black sheep in the universities, was a Higher Education Free Speech Act, which was the first piece of legislation in Europe, which has provided, essentially requires universities to protect and promote free speech and free expression. Okay, and that took us 2.5 years to get that passed under a Conservative government. It was not easy. But that goes to show just how much these ideas have been mainstreamed, even in Britain, but also how weak the opposition to those ideas is within the established political class. And so we do need a party like Reform to shake things up. I couldn't possibly tell you who wrote the Reform Party manifesto. I couldn't possibly tell you who put ideas into the mix to say, actually, we're going to have an immediate ban on the teaching of critical race theory in our primary and secondary schools. But Reform was the only party to say that at the last election. They were the only party to say, if we teach kids about Britain's legacy of empire and Britain's involvement in the slave trade, then we must simultaneously teach children about non-Western countries and their involvement in the same practices. They were the only party to call for our government institutions to remain politically neutral and independent. And so the flag has been put down in the sand. And I don't want to see us descend into the intensity of the arguments that have gripped American politics. I'm hoping that Britain can avoid that, but that requires a strong and intellectually coherent Conservative Party, which again is absent currently on the landscape.
I'd like to take a question from the audience, if I may. Actually, there's a gentleman right there in the front row. Actually, I think he needs a microphone, actually.
Hi, how are you? So I guess my question is how you would square your analysis with the most recent general election results for the two most recent Conservative prime ministers. In particular, I'm thinking, you have Rishi Sunak, who is very much identified with the moderate side of the party, and you also have Liz Truss, who you didn't mention very much, but I suppose was only prime minister for 7 weeks.
We could talk about the lettuce if you'd like.
Sure. Well, no, I mean, I was sure. But I mean, I was just, they represented similar districts with 26,000 vote majorities. And Liz Truss, who's much more conservative, at least in how she positions herself here, she is the only former prime minister to actually lose the seat. How does that square with your analysis compared to Sunak, who survived?
Well, Rishi Sunak he came close to losing his seat.
That's quite an achievement. She
Sure.
actually was representing a constituency in rural Norfolk, one of the most conservative places in the United Kingdom, where the royal family have their standing in the state. She had an independent conservative candidate standing against her, as well as a reform candidate, and she lost a 26,000 majority. I mean, at what point does she start taking credit for her own failures? You can't blame anyone else for that. I mean, she, as it was said by the gentleman in the front row, she's the first former British Prime Minister who voted out of her own constituency, her own district.
Well, Liz Truss was also the most unpopular Prime Minister in the history of polling. She quickly collapsed in the polls to have a rating of -40. And if you want a reference point, Prince Andrew is -60. So that will give you some kind of reference point. Look, I mean, Liz Truss was fiscally conservative. Some of the ideas that she had were not a million miles from what I think we ultimately will need to see in our country if we're going to revive growth. And I'll just say one thing in defense of Liz Truss before a couple of other things. What we do need in our country is a radical rethink of our growth strategy. because big tax, big state, big debt, this is not sustainable, and everybody knows it. So we need to be able to have a very frank conversation about what the radical alternative to that is going to be. Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng tried to have that conversation. What happened, however, is when they came into power, they managed it terribly, and they managed it disastrously. And they underestimated the bureaucrats, they underestimated the blob, if you like, and they made a series of strategic errors very early on that really caused their own demise. And I personally think that it would probably be in the interest of the Conservative Party if that particular group of Conservatives were not as prominent in the ongoing debate about the future of the party. We do need to step back and have a much more honest and radical conversation about how we're going to fix our country's problems, and it makes me very nervous that nobody now seems to be willing to stand up and suggest some radical alternatives to the consensus, because they are immediately shot down. And one thing the Labour government, Andrew, has already done is empower the very body that actually helped to bring down Liz Truss, which is the Office for Budget Responsibility. So what is happening, this is really important, is the state is being weaponized in a very serious way to ensure that radical challenges in the future to this centre-left, big state, big tax consensus really won't be able to get any takeoff. They won't be able to leave the runway because the blob will instantly shoot them down. And this is a really big problem for Conservatives going forward.
I think we have an online question, Paul. Do we have an online question? I was waiting for the mic.
Thank you. Professor Goodwin, given that the Reform Party manifesto is a Thatcherite document, is Nigel Farage the new Margaret Thatcher?
Really good question. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure he only sleeps 3 or 4 nights. 3 or 4 hours a night, like Margaret Thatcher, but for different reasons. Yeah, I think it's fair to say I've known Nigel for 15 years. He's instinctively a Thatcherite, fiscally conservative, big Atlanticist, big believer in the United States of America, big believer in the special relationship. Is a maverick, is a disruptor, is an incredible campaigner, better than Boris Johnson, very, very strong, and he's got stronger by watching events in America. He's inheriting the post-Brexit realignment, and if he's careful, he can go from 14% of the national vote, which is what he got 2 weeks ago, to somewhere closer to 20, maybe 25%. But he has a very big decision to make, which is he willing to strike a deal with the Conservative Party? What kind of deal is he willing to strike? What does that look like? And where does he want to take the Conservative family? Because the answers to the problems today are not only found in the 1980s. What Thatcher was giving people was economic freedom. What people want today is not just economic freedom, they want cultural freedom from this oppressive, stifling orthodoxy, not just from the state, not just from wokeism, but also from mass migration. They want a restoration of shared values, shared identity, shared ways of life, all the things that make us who we are. And I think what Farage has realized, and he alluded to this during the campaign, is in Europe, we can all sense that we are reaching what you might call a civilizational moment, in the sense that we are no longer really sure what is it that makes us and us anymore, as we're being assaulted on all sides, not just by the winds of economic change, but also demography, migration, radical Islamism, and a political class that doesn't really appear willing or capable to respond to those threats. And if Farage is careful, he will be able to step into that space and expand his coalition But as I say, he's then going to have to decide how he takes the Conservative family, because it is a family. Farage is just as much a Conservative as David Cameron and George Osborne are, even though they're from different wings. They are ultimately all under the same tent, and he's going to have to think very carefully about how he takes that Conservative family forward. But my last remark perhaps would be that the realignment we've lived through, there's still ample public demand for Conservative policies. The problem is on the supply side. That is my diagnosis of where Britain is. We're not turning into a left-wing nation. The problem is we have not had Conservative Party elites who have been willing to supply that demand with the right policies, the right leaders, and the right messages that are capable of mobilizing it at the ballot box.
Looking at the Conservative Party, I have several people I know who've gone for selection. Indeed, I actually know civil servants who've gone for selection for various political parties. One thing that the people go for selection to be on the candidates list for the Conservative Party, they go and do an online form, I'm told. Then they go for a selection interview at Conservative Party headquarters in London. And I was quite disturbed by some of the questions they were asked to screen them out. One of them was, do you support the Black Lives Matter organization? And if you say no, you can't be on the list. You can't run as a Conservative Party candidate. If you're asked, do you support 24 weeks abortion? And if you say, I don't, I'm pro-life, or I'd like to limit that in some way, you can't be on the candidates list. This is quite... If Margaret Thatcher were to return, would she recognize this party, or would they recognize her? And when did this happen? How did that is actually a mission. They clearly have gone on a mission to try to weed out Thatcherites. How did this happen? Who did this? Who started this process?
Well, I suspect if Margaret Thatcher were to return, she would probably end up in the Reform Party rather than the Conservative Party. That would be my read. It happened through the changing composition of the Conservative elite.
Yeah.
I mean, that essentially is what happened. CCHQ, Conservative Party headquarters, is notoriously more socially liberal than even the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Most of the people around Boris Johnson, to go back to that example, were basically full-on net zero social liberals. I mean, seriously, if you actually look at the people who are around Conservative prime ministers, I mean, these were people who were fully bought into the establishment consensus. So as I say, you don't just need to change the MPs, you need to change the architecture, the infrastructure of the Conservative Party to ensure that the people who are being selected are coming from a much wider range of backgrounds, of political viewpoints, of life experiences, because the Conservative Parliamentary Party today, as I've said, is primarily Southern, it is Oxbridge educated, and it is socially liberal. And we know over the last 30 years that the graduate class have gradually have sort of radicalized, have moved sharply leftwards on social and cultural issues, and that includes lots of people within the British Conservative camp. So changing the infrastructure of the party, I think, is essential, and selecting people from a wider background. And also many of the people that are selected now, you know, were special advisors of Conservative MPs, were party insiders, and to be frank, a lot of the MPs who have been selected in 2024 were responsible for the failures of the last 14 years. If you look at many of the people that work with Rishi Sunak, you know, they've either gone into the Lords or they've been selected for safe seats. These are people who presided over the biggest defeat for the Conservative Party on record. How do you reward failure like that? I don't understand. I think if you're supposedly a ruthless political party that is one of the most successful parties in the history of democracy, you'd think those people would be gutted out. But they were given safe seats. It's almost as though the Conservatives are intent on digging their own grave.
And there's a lot of unemployed Conservatives now, so-called Conservatives, and beware, a lot of them are coming to Washington looking for work.
Including former prime ministers.
Clearly, yes, indeed. We've just had two at the Republican National Convention. I want to look at the Liberal Democrats for a moment, if we may. The Liberal Party...
Do we have to?
Oh, well, we have to. The Liberal Democrat Party received 3.5 million votes, and they won 72 seats. The brand new Reform Party, which is just brand new, got 4 million votes, 500,000 more, but they won only 5 seats. How did that happen?
Well, we have a first-past-the-post system, and that generated the most disproportional election result that we've had in post-war history. The Reform Party needed 800,000 votes for every one of its 5 MPs. The Labour Party needed somewhere around 30, 40,000 votes for every one of its MPs. This is a system that punishes small challenger parties that haven't built up that deep, concentrated support. So to go back to the Conservative civil war or ideological battle, the first thing Farage needs to do is start building that deep, concentrated support in areas that he can use to convert that support into members of parliament. And that's why a large number of parties are now campaigning for proportional representation, for PR, for electoral reform. Personally, I think that's the wrong decision. If you look at the literature on PR systems, they deliver more left-wing governments over the longer term, and they can lead to an enormous amount of gridlock and a bargaining over governments that can go for months and years. And to be frank, if we were to change our election system, it would undermine the whole basis of the Westminster model that has governed our politics throughout our entire history. So I would like to see the Conservatives and Reform campaign to keep the first-past-the-post system. But they're going to have to work together to do that, and ultimately they're going to have to get to that tipping point whereby if you're winning millions of votes, you're also then seeing that reflected in the number of seats. Just one stat to keep in mind. Again, don't fall into the trap of thinking the Labour government have an enormous mandate. They won 33% of the national vote, but 63% of all seats, right? But this government rests on support from just 33% of voters. And that is a lower share of the vote for Labour than in 2017, and it's much lower than what Tony Blair polled during his heyday. This is a government that is on weak foundations, even if the system has given it an enormous majority.
And in 100 of those seats that Labour won, I've read that the Reform Party came in second.
Yeah.
Will that affect any of their policy decisions? You'd think that they would actually be aware of that because they wouldn't want to have to lose 100 of those seats to Reform at the next election.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, again, Farage and Reform have 2 flanks opening up. You know, they're hitting Conservatives in southern, more affluent Tory shires in parts of southern England, but they're now also opening up a second flank against the Labour Party in Rust Belt type areas in northern England. And I don't need to tell Republicans about the potential that exists in those areas in terms of changing the nature of conservatism and opening up a new source of votes. That means attacking the Labour Party relentlessly in terms of what it's doing on illegal migration, giving an amnesty to 100,000 illegal migrants. It means attacking them in terms of going soft on crime, in terms of mainstreaming woke ideology, in terms of increasing legal migration, in terms of expanding the state, in terms of empowering unelected, unaccountable government organizations. It means basically going all out at targeting this Labour government while also pointing to the Conservatives and reminding them about what is the Conservative position on many of these issues. So I don't think Nigel Farage, who I think was in I think he was in America only a few days ago at the RNC, and you know, he obviously has spent a long time talking at the rallies here with Trump and talking to many of the same kinds of voters in the US. I don't think he's ever had as much space as he's had today. You know, I think this is a really pivotal moment in British politics, and one that is obviously directly inspired by the events in America over the last 5-6 years.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank our online audience for joining us today, but for all of our friends here present here in the Barbara Van Andel Gaby room here at the Heritage Foundation, I welcome you to a reception right now here in this room. Thank you so very much, Professor.
Thank you.